I think it's fair to say that ISO is probably the easiest part of the exposure triangle to understand. In comparison with the shutter or aperture settings, we're not exactly allowing more light to be captured by the sensor. We are making the sensor more sensitive to light, but it amounts to much the same thing. The ISO range that we typically see on our cameras is 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600 and 3200. So it's pretty easy to remember. The important issue is that the ISO settings increase or decrease the sensitivity of the sensor to light. But increasing the ISO also increases the noise we may see in our photographs. 100 ISO is generally the lowest sensitivity, and although I'm generalizing a little bit here, most photographers I think would rather stay between 100 and 400 ISO. As we can see here, the sensitivity of the sensor increases by one stop with each change of the ISO. 200 ISO is twice as sensitive to light as 100, and 400 ISO is twice as sensitive to light as 200. This amounts to one stop, or the equivalent of doubling the exposure, which is exactly the same as we see with apertures and shutter speeds. So the fact that we refer to these three as the exposure triangle makes perfect sense. As we move down the list to 800, 1600 and 3200 ISO, we see the same one-stop difference between each setting. Now these last three settings would generally be considered by photographers as high ISOs for the reasons I mentioned earlier in relation to noise in the images. I'm going to cover this quality trade-off and noise in more detail later, but we can say that generally it's best to keep the ISO as low as we possibly can. So if we need to increase exposure, it's best to look at the shutter speeds and the aperture options as our first choice. If you're in a lighting situation where to capture a sharp image you need a high ISO, I'm referring to a situation where you can't easily adjust the shutter or aperture anymore, then you should select the high ISO, because there's always something we can do to defeat noise, but there's very little we can do with a blurred shot. Now this picture is evidence of this, shot indoors with no flash, relying on the light coming through the window. The aperture that I used for this shot was f5.6, which was the maximum aperture that I had on the particular lens I used. So to be able to get just a slow 15th of a second shutter speed, I had little choice but to push the ISO up to the maximum on my particular camera, which is 1600 ISO. Now I'm drifting slightly away from just looking at exposure here, but a 15th of a second is quite slow to handhold. But what we do in those circumstances is we recognize that fact and we take precautions, and we'll deal with this a little bit later too.